Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Cedar.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Wednesday, May 27th, 2020. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the five-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps and steps and steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Dr. Touré Reed, professor of history at Illinois State University. His book, Toward Freedom, The Case versus Race Reductionism. Meanwhile, Trump's assault on Inspector General protesters tear-gassed in Minneapolis. It's 4 officers fired over the killing unarmed black man, Floyd. Department of Justice drops insider trading investigations of Loeffler, Inhofe, and Feinstein. A new report, Trump White House quashed OSHA regulation process that would have called for hospital respiratory pandemic readiness. Who needs it? Meanwhile, Trump calls for Republican House members to vote no on the FISA reauthor, presumably because it doesn't mention Obamagate. GOP sues to stop proxy voting in the House. Trump's USDA is gearing emergency food assistance away from blue states in the Northeast. Trump says the Health and Human Services will cap Medicare insulin costs next year. Our government and money helped develop the potential coronavirus treatment. But surprise, surprise, we will have no say whatsoever in what it will cost, nor shall we participate in its profits. Lastly, Alabama COVID infections surge 2 weeks after restaurants opened. Imagine that. All this and more on today's program that we will be doing right now. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show. I hope you're doing okay. This, we're heading into the malaise part of the. I think for I don't know, maybe it's different in every part of the country. I keep hearing sort of like different reports of what's going on in California. Some people say they're not taking it that seriously, but they've been on top of it for quite a while. I imagine if you're in the Ozarks, you don't even realize anything is going on. But we shall see. We got a pretty good clip of, I have almost since the beginning of this program, I've had my issues with Andrew Ross Sorkin. I mean, certainly back in like the around the Occupy days, I remember critiquing a lot of what he had to say on television. But I appreciated this. I mean, look, the whole financial television world is in many respects, I don't know how to phrase this. It's the whole thing is sort of, there's a certain rancid quality to all of it, right? I mean, and not necessarily like look, I don't begrudge anybody whatever kind of TV they want to watch or their hobbies or, how to make more money or whatever it is. But because it's geared towards such a small sector of our society, and I'm saying this like literally. I mean, Fox Business, I think they may have less people watch their program on a given day, at noon than watch this one. I think that's actually possible. But all the people who do, they're constantly in the market for a new, I don't know, whatever the car is, fancy car or whatever it is. And that's what CNBC does too. Their market, they drive their ad revenue not on the number of people who are watching, but on the incomes of the people who are watching. And so it's very much programming that is oriented toward these people. The people who host these shows are of that ilk, and their whole value system is a function of that. But it's nice occasionally to see at least some semblance of recognition of like that human beings are not just what did that libertarian say the other day? Like or the accountant from the White House, human capital or something to the I don't know.
Human capital stock.
Human capital stock. Here is Andrew Ross Sorkin. We show this exchange with that really odious Joe Kernan. And they have just like gone back and forth with a little bit with the news. And then I guess there's a little tension there because Sorkin has been too PC, as the president would say, because he's apparently, encourages people to wear masks or something.
What will you tell us about what's happening
Still
right now?
Still looking at the coincident and lagging indicator. Let's see. For a while, it was how can stocks be where they are because of oil prices? Remember, that was your take then.
Right.
How can it be based on where interest rates are right now? Then it could be how can stocks be, right. And then it was every single discussion you have over the weekend is about how can stock prices be here when the economy is here. Right. Now it's going to be your earnings, but can you see how that probably isn't the coincidence, the stuff Joe. Right in your face? We're going to have David Lebovitz on. He's going to say every client he talks to is asking him, how can the stock market be here when everything else is...
And that's the question.
Pause it for 1 second.
And there are a lot of smart people...
Listen, we know the answer. It's because they've poured trillions of dollars into this sector to prop it all up. And they just haven't done the same on the fiscal side. I mean, I don't know why they're, maybe it's like, it's partly because it's like, this is their religion. And they don't want to get on television and say like, oh, incidentally, like, whatever, I don't know. He didn't really resurrect 3 days later, or they didn't really part the Red Sea, or, the Easter Bunny isn't real. Nobody wants to say that. Make themselves feel bad and realize that all of their expertise is really just a function of how much money is being pumped into it. Good.
Have that view. You may not have that view.
Why is that the smart people? They've been wrong for 35%. Why are they smart? Just because they can see what's right in front of their nose? That doesn't make them smart. It makes them.
Joe, you missed it on the way down too.
Makes them not savvy about the market.
Joe, you missed it. You missed Joe. You missed it 100% on the way down, and you missed the 100,000 deaths. So we can have this debate back and forth, and you can try to question the questions I'm asking. But there are smart people, including your friend Stan Druckenmiller, who has argued that the market has been over. Hold on. I'm not going to do this with you, Joe. Every morning you try to question the questions I'm asking. These are questions that investors are asking every single morning. I am just trying to get through some of this clutter. I may be right. I may be wrong. Investors may be right. They may be wrong. That's what makes a market. But it doesn't make people a good person or a bad person. It doesn't make it right to act the way you are. I'm sorry.
Okay. You yelled at the poor guy about the guy yesterday with masks. It's like, why are you yelling at me now?
I'm not, Joe.
You just yelled again. I don't know. I'm just trying to.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry?
No, you're not. No, you're not, Joe. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead with the news.
You panicked about the market, panicked about COVID, panicked about the ventilators, panicked about the PPE, panicked about ever going out again, panicked that we'd ever get back to normal.
Joseph, you didn't panic about anything.
What good is it? Why not help people
died.
Keep their head? I understand that.
100,000 people died, Joe, and all you did was try to help your friend, the president. That's what you did. Every single morning on this show. Every single morning on this show, you have used and abused your position, Joe.
That's totally unfair.
You have used and abused your position.
I'm trying to help investors keep their cool, keep their heads, and as it turned out, that's what they should have done. That's what they should have done. They should have kept their heads. If they had listened to you, Andrew, we're supposed to be at about 8,000.
I wasn't arguing to go sell your stocks, Joseph. I was arguing about people's lives.
We understand.
People's lives.
Andrew,
that's
it's a global pandemic.
Do the news. I'm begging you to do the news, Joseph.
It's a global pandemic.
I'm begging you.
Andy,
please.
It's a global pandemic, Andy, where per capita deaths, we're down near the low end of per capita deaths. We're nowhere near per 100,000. Most places are at 60 deaths per 100,000. We're at 29. So it's terrible that we've lost 100,000 lives. It's terrible. But it was never going to be that we weren't going to come back and that we weren't going to return to normal. And, siding with Ackman and everything else that, giving credence to all that panic didn't help any investors at all or people with their anxiety and everything else. So that's why we're here, to try and navigate people through, not to trying to help Donald Trump. Anyway, let's look at Tesla. News.
There you go. Let's look at Tesla. The complete, I guess I think it's willful ignorance on this part of this guy to sort of recognize that the anxiety in the form of, trying to convince people that this is real enough that you should go out and wear a mask if you go out, when you go out. The anxiety in terms of and what's also sort of shocking is this guy's talking like he's done some type of big public service to maintain the calm of investors. Meanwhile, there's 30 some odd million people without jobs. There are people who are worried about their unemployment benefits running out in a month and a half. People don't have health insurance. You've got frontline workers who have been devastated by this because of the failure of securing PPE. All of that is just sort of secondary to the fact that we salvaged the market, which of course was just a function of the Fed pumping trillions of dollars into it with, $500 billion worth of collateral from Congress. But there it is. Nice to see Andrew Ross Sorkin have a moment of humanity. I don't watch the show enough to know if he's more human like that, but relative to that guy, that Joe Kernan guy, it's nice to see at least just a little slight splash of that. Meanwhile, one of today's sponsors is BetterHelp. And they're giving our audience 10% off their first month when you go to betterhelp.com/majority report. BetterHelp gives you access to your own fully licensed and accredited therapist via phone, via chat, via video. Now more than ever, folks, people could use this. I'm seeing a report, a third of Americans now show signs of clinical anxiety or depression. This is according to the Census Bureau, I guess. I know there's a piece in Washington Post, but a lot of therapists have long wait lists. It can take weeks or months before they can connect with you. But when you sign up with BetterHelp, they match you with a therapist based on your specific needs, and you'll be communicating with them in less than 24 hours. Once BetterHelp connects you with a therapist, if you think it's not a good fit, super easy. You switch to a new one at any time. You can do so for any reason. No additional charge, nothing. They make it seamless. They have thousands of licensed therapists from all over the country. They have therapists with specialties that may not be available in your area that you wouldn't even begin to know how to look for. BetterHelp also tends to be more affordable than therapists you'd find through traditional means. You don't have to have insurance when you use BetterHelp, and they have financial aid options for those who qualify. BetterHelp is giving everyone in our audience 10% off your first month when you go to betterhelp.com/majority report. That's BetterHelp, TTERHELP.com/majority report. We're going to take a quick break, and we come back. We'll be talking to Dr. Touré Reed, professor of history from Illinois State University. Toward Freedom, the case versus race reductionism. Be right back. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Dr. Touré Reed. He is a professor of African American and 20th century history at Illinois State University, author Toward Freedom, the Case versus Race Reductionism. Touré, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
So let's the book basically traces the policies that and how they impact Black folk in America and white folk in America, for that matter, through starting with the New Deal, through the Fair Deal and the Second Bill of Rights, and then through the post-war period. And in some instances, you use Ta-Nehisi Coates as sort of an avatar of the changes that have taken place in the perspective of of policies in the post-war era. Let's just start with the premise of your book, because it basically tries to deal with the a misconception of what liberals, I guess, a policy set has been towards dealing with race, and specifically things like Black poverty and social, I guess, socioeconomic problems.
Yes. Should I tell you a little bit about how I got what prompted me to write the book?
Sure.
And what the impetus for writing the book was dated back to late 2015. And when I'd written an article that was for Jacobin magazine called "Why Liberals Separate Race from Class." And the article was a response to a then commonplace misconception. And it was a critique of the Sanders campaign that was based on this commonplace misconception that liberal social policy had failed African Americans because liberals had purportedly been guilty of what people would call class reductionism, right? And class reductionism would refer to a tendency to treat as secondary issues that, such as racism or sexism or fill in the blank, right? And so this claim that in late 2015, there was a claim that Sanders' redistributive agenda was, again, the latest iteration of a decades-long liberal tendency to ignore racism. And what struck me about that claim was that it was essentially a declaration of up is down. There is no doubt, if you are alive and paying attention, that post-war liberalism had failed to bring an end to racial disparities, right? To close the racial wealth gap or to eliminate wage disparities. There's no doubt about that. But what was striking about, again, this characterization that post-war liberalism had failed Blacks because of a tendency towards class reductionism, which Ta-Nehisi Coates is one of the most visible champions of that view, was it was tantamount to a declaration of up is down. Post-war liberalism had failed, again, to redress inequities, but it would have been more accurate to say that failure was owed to a tendency of liberals, to abstract racial disparities from the political and economic forces that engendered them in the post-war era, right? So in other words, post-war liberalism's failures were probably more accurately understood as a failure of race reductionism rather than class reductionism.
Okay, fair enough. And so you look at the New Deal and sort of, I guess, reinterpret it from the reinterpretation or the sort of the in fashion perspective on it as why African Americans who were maybe more likely to be domestic workers were left out of things like Social Security or agricultural workers. And you also go through the other, sort of, I guess, the home ownership policies. Tell us about those.
Sure. There's been an interesting evolution in the way that people talk about the New Deal and its limitations. And I think there's no doubt that the New Deal had its problems. But whereas in the 1980s and 1990s, the left critique of New Deal and post-war liberalism, which is the critique of New Deal and post-war liberalism that I was introduced to when I was in grad school, let's say, and in college, and it's certainly one that I hold firmly, which is that the New Deal certainly failed to extend the benefits, and post-war liberalism failed to distribute their benefits evenly. Whites benefited more from, let's say, the National Labor Relations Act, right, which makes it easier for workers to join unions, or whites benefited unambiguously more from FHA mortgage policies, which essentially redlined Blacks out of home ownership. But whereas left academics in the 1980s and 1990s, people like Michael Katz, people like Joe Cordano, people like Michael K. Brown, Adolph L. Reed, who, for the sake of full disclosure, is my dad. They had made this very case in the 80s and 90s, late 80s and 90s, at the dawn of, towards the end of Reaganism and beginning of Clintonism, that the welfare state had been critically important, not just to the expansion of the Black middle class, which conservatives had certainly argued as part of their case against programs like affirmative action, but the welfare state had been even more important to the life chances of the white middle class, and that the principal beneficiaries, these leftists had argued, and again, the late 80s through the Clinton years, the principal beneficiaries of federal largesse were actually whites, and the white middle class was built, they'd argued, on the foundation of a welfare state. Those authors in that era had made this case not just in defense of protecting programs that benefited Blacks disproportionately, such as AFDC, which we know Bill Clinton signed out of existence, but also affirmative action. They had also made a case for a truly universal set of redistributive programs, right? Because they argued that the New Deal's failures were owed in part to the fact that its universalism was far from universal, right? That there were exemptions, essentially, that precluded the moniker of universalism being assigned to the great universal New Deal programs. In more recent years, people who identify as leftists, interestingly enough, along with conservatives, have pointed to the deficiencies of the New Deal as a case against a welfare state, right? I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only person who's read a truckload of thought pieces on the racist origins, let's say, of the minimum wage, which actually the minimum wage did a lot to redress disparities in agriculture. Once the minimum wage was extended to agricultural workers, racial disparities in agriculture had diminished substantially, if not were fully eliminated, right? And a host of other such anti-statist, essays. And so the point that I'm making about the New Deal, which is, not a point that I can lay claim to, because it predates me by a lot, certainly predates me as a scholar by a lot, is that its inadequacies notwithstanding, now, at this very moment, the way that many people who identify as progressives have characterized it, really overlooks the critical importance of the New Deal to Black Americans, and likewise, and we can talk about the critical importance of the New Deal to Black Americans if you'd like, but it likewise plays into a conservative assault on the kinds of policies that would be, essential to eliminating things like, I don't know, the racial wage gap, right? So this is the basic point that I make, which complicates our current understanding of the New Deal. But I want to stress that I'm not even the originator of such a narrative, right? I draw from other scholars.
Okay, all right. So fair enough. I mean, so I think the idea, but I mean, you're open to the critique of the New Deal as, I think, I mean, the way that I perceive it is characterized is that there was a certain amount of racism embedded in the way that the New Deal was passed, that, and that there were concessions made, arguably made to industry. Those industries wanted those concessions. I don't want to have to pay I don't want to have to pay taxes on my agricultural laborers, right? But that maybe it was race that provided the weak link where that would be where the concession went, right? Like where, water finds its lowest point on some level, that the pressures were most successful in those areas where they could trade off of race, which doesn't necessarily, which doesn't, in my estimation, diminish the value of the New Deal across the board, but does have that feature.
Well, I mean, let's go back to one of the policies that you mentioned in passing as the setup, because I would want to complicate the narrative that the New Deal's racial limits And I think it's reasonable to cast them as such, insofar as blacks do not benefit equally from New Deal policies, and no one on the left has argued that they have. Actually, that's one of the things that makes them leftists rather than liberals. But let's take Social Security, for example, which is commonly understood. So there are exemptions in Social Security that exclude domestic and agricultural workers from the benefits of Social Security. There's no doubt that Southern legislators, right, Southern members of Congress had made racist arguments in defense of excluding those workers, agricultural and domestic workers, from Social Security coverage. But it's also quite apparent that the end game wasn't motivated, certainly not exclusively, and I would say not principally, by racism, and definitely not racism the way that people talk about it today, as if it's a demon that's inexorable, but rather it's very clear that large farmers, plantation owners, we'll call them, because that's what they were, had opposed the extension of Social Security coverage to agricultural workers, period, irrespective of race. And the clearest expression of this is that the majority of workers who were excluded by those exemptions, the majority of workers, the clear majority, over 70% of the workers that were excluded from Social Security by way of the exemptions for domestic and agricultural workers were, surprise, surprise, white. And if you look at the position that that plantation owners and, of course, their farm lobby had staked out, it was, as you said, a desire not to pay taxes. But the fact of the matter is, it also included concern about the government treading on their managerial prerogatives. But the fact of the matter is that if 74% of the workers who were excluded from Social Security Act coverage, and specifically from those exemptions for domestic and agricultural workers were white, and 23% of those workers who were excluded by way of those exemptions were black, that has to complicate the narrative that the principal impetus behind the exclusion of those workers was white people's, all of them, visceral attachment to something that we might call white skin privilege. It's very clearly more complicated than that. And that complicating factor is not a pass. In fact, I would argue, as many leftists do, that what those exemptions from Social Security Act, and they apply to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which establishes overtime pay and a minimum wage. And there are even exemptions, of course, for agricultural workers that one gets from the National Labor Relations Act as well. But what those exemptions for Social Security and the Fair Labor Standards Act reveal as one of the crucial limitations of the New Deal, which was that its end game was essentially to right a listing capitalist economy. It worked certainly to the benefit of working people, but the end game of the New Deal was also to make a fairer and more sustainable model of capitalism, which put New Dealers in a position, and I would say many embraced it, and in which they sometimes made much greater concessions to capital than they made to workers, right? All the workers, all of the agricultural workers who were exempted from Social Security Act coverage were screwed, right? But again, I'm going to beat this dead horse. If 74% of the workers who were excluded from SSA coverage were white, then that tells you that it's got to be more than just racism. I'll add one other thing. There were about close to a dozen categories of workers who were exempted from Social Security coverage. I think the lion's share of workers who were covered worked in industry and commerce, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But many of those occupations in which that were exempted from Social Security coverage, like I believe medical doctors were exempted, let's say, blacks were quite underrepresented among the share of workers in those fields.
I mean, fair enough. I guess to attribute all of it to race obviously is belied by the 74% of white workers, and on some level there's we see an analog in terms of the reassertion, post Reconstruction, the reassertion of voting restrictions across the country, like poll taxes and literacy tests, which would exclude, very often would exclude poor white people as well. as well as African Americans. I mean, I guess it's tough to divine the motivation of these people. I guess to me, it's just a function of like, it was undoubtedly every industry wanted to be exempted, right? I mean, and every capitalist wanted to be the one who got their exemption, but the one who could leverage race as a cover on some level. Maybe it was a cover, maybe it wasn't, but I mean, I think that there's certainly an argument that it was successful. And I think also, from an FHA standpoint, it's not, it's not quite as clear, but on some level, if you don't have money to buy a house, you can't get a mortgage anyways. But the idea at that point is that the policies were certainly more oriented towards a class disposition than we saw following World War II.
Sure. Yeah. By the way, I just want to go back to the excellent Reconstruction corollary you drew. I mean, there is a constant between the efforts of the conservative elements in the South, conservative Democrats, to press ahead on disenfranchisement by way of literacy requirements and a host of grandfather's clauses, et cetera. And between that and one column and the desire of agribusiness to exclude workers, sharecroppers, and other agricultural workers from Social Security coverage, and that's a desire to maintain managerial prerogatives, and of course the quest for cheap labor, right? And again, it's important not to lose sight of that, end game. It's likewise important with respect to Social Security coverage, just for the sake of argument, to not lose sight of the fact that those exemptions to Social Security for agriculture and domestic workers ended in the 50s. So it wasn't an indefinite thing, and it's certainly not something that I would support had I been alive. But I do want to stress on that point that the American Farm Bureau, which was the largest agricultural lobby of the day, right, for in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, had not only opposed the extension of Social Security coverage to agricultural workers, they didn't want it for the land-owning proprietors either. They didn't want to pay the tax, and they certainly didn't want the government intruding on their affairs, right? And that's not uncommon for various kinds of business. But agribusiness, I think, didn't imagine that they could weather the taxes effectively. So FHA mortgage policy is relevant too, and that's a very clear example of institutional racism. But I think it's also important not to lose sight of the fact that the redlining policies, which were horrendous, and in fact, one of the more despicable aspects of it is that it's not until the Civil Rights Act of 1968 that formal barriers to Black homeownership are eliminated, with, of course, some caveats. But nevertheless, the FHA policies in question were drafted with input from the real estate and banking industries, and that gets us right back to one of the critical problems of New Deal policy was its deference to capital. It wasn't illustrative of the inherent limitations of white people en masse. It wasn't illustrative of the inherent limitations of government to do right by the citizenry. But it certainly was illustrative of the limitations of government to do right by the citizenry in the context of an end game of doing right by capital.
Right. And to a certain extent, though, too, it strikes me as, and I guess this is, the central thesis of your book, that, reductionism is wrong in this regard. But there's an interplay here, right? Where capital wants to basically preclude this legislation, whatever legislation it is, from inhibiting its ability to profit. And it seems, at least in that era, and I would probably argue in certain other circumstances in our own, that it is most successful at doing that when it has, race as one of its arrows in its quiver.
Well, certainly race functions as a vehicle for divide and conquer. But if those of us who understand ourselves to be liberals or progressive treat race as something that exists, that is a force of nature, right? If we treat race as something other than a human contrivance, as an ideology, and if we treat racism as something other than an expression of a commitment to race, the idea that there are biological or quasi-biological hierarchies, that we call racial groups, then it's going to continue to function as a vehicle to undermine the end game for America's working people, right? If we think that race is something that just is an inexorable force of nature, and that racism by extension is an inexorable force of nature, then of course this will function as is its intent, going back to the 19th century, and the it in this case is race's intent, as a vehicle for naturalizing, for reifying hierarchies that are, the product of human contrivance, that they're organic to capitalism, but it's also going to continue to function, to keep people numb to the realities of the real forces that are undercutting their livelihoods, their security in themselves, their ability to, pay for their kids to go to college, or just again, maintain a stable and reasonable existence.
Let's get into when the shift happens, in terms of the way that, I guess, your argument is the way that liberals approached socioeconomic disparities between races. There was a shift in the way that liberals address this.
Yeah. So in the post-war era, liberals become much less invested in economic inequality. They don't give up on it, obviously. And certainly what happens more to the point in terms of people's perception of racial inequities is that during the Cold War, liberals will move away from political economic understandings of racial inequality and gravitate more and more to what I would call, race reductionist models, but the race reductionist framework is pretty broad, to constructs that essentially treat race and attitudes as if they are real or inborn. And the matter of treating race as if it's real or inborn is complicated insofar as the language that liberals use in the post-war era to discuss racial inequality is culturalist. And culture and race aren't supposed to be the same thing, right? Race is a social construct. It's not a real biological category, but race is supposed to be a biological category. Culture is just how a population shaped by common experience views the world. And so culture is fluid and dynamic. Race, again, is supposed to be static. Culture, by contrast, is something that anyone can acquire through exposure and shared experience and just interacting with other people over time. The culturalist constructs that liberals tend to use in the post-war era to discuss racial inequality or to make sense of it actually aren't really culture so much in the anthropological sense of the word. They are much closer to what race is supposed to be, insofar as people like historian Oscar Hamlin, or maybe more importantly, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who I know that a lot of your listeners would be familiar with, when they attach themselves to constructs like ethnic pluralism and culture poverty, the way that they discuss ethnic identities and culture, and ethnic identities are cultural identities. They're not supposed to be, biological identities, which is what race is supposed to be, right? So the way that they discuss ethnic group culture and culture poverty presumes that groups can have norms and worldviews that may originate in shared experience, but that become ingrained in them and essentially become the essence of what they are. And the moment you uncouple culture from the material world, you presume, again, that you could take a population or even individuals outside of its milieu and plop it someplace else, and they'll just remain what they were forever. That's not culture, that's race. So the constructs that post-war liberals tend to coalesce around to explain inequities really are essentially racialist constructs. There's culture attached to it, which implies fluidity. But when you look at how they think about inequality, it's really a lot more like race. And that allows liberals in the post-war era, like during the Johnson administration, to ignore the culture of poverty specifically, allows liberals to diminish the impact of the structural changes that were taking place in the U.S. economy, the very structural changes that were taking place in the U.S. economy that civil rights activists at the March on Washington in 1963 demanded that President Kennedy and then eventually President Johnson pay attention to: automation, urban deindustrialization, which were having a disproportionate impact on Blacks. Liberals during the war on poverty tended to diminish the impact of these structural changes on the U.S. economy and the structural changes of the U.S. economy, the impact on Blacks, and instead were more disposed to attribute Black poverty to racial discrimination, which was a factor, and there's no question about that, but also the cultural deficiencies of the Black poor themselves. And that framework, that culture poverty framework, again, functioned as an escape hatch to ignore the way that deindustrialization and automation were having a disproportionate impact on Blacks. And it is worth stressing that while someone like Daniel Patrick Moynihan is celebrated today, from the 80s to this very day, for his prescience and for seeing the failure of the war on poverty to eliminate Black poverty, it's stunning that he is celebrated for his prescience when leftists like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, who were the two principal organizers of the 1963 March on Washington, and also put together what was called the Freedom Budget for All. Other leftists like Michael Harrington and Charles Killingsworth and a host of others had likewise predicted that the war on poverty's emphasis simply on anti-discrimination policies, which again were very, very important, but insufficient.
Right.
And of course, efforts to provide cultural tutelage to poor Blacks and other poor people. When they predicted that those policies would fail because of deindustrialization, we don't remember that, right? And I know that all of your listeners know that we haven't lived in an economy, under an economy in the U.S. that has been an industrial economy for decades at this point, right? The process of deindustrialization dates back to the 1950s. And yet we don't think about the impact of the disproportionate impact of deindustrialization, the decline of the union movement as well on Blacks and other low-skilled workers. We should.
Can you give like some tangible examples of those policies and how they were specifically directed at what was ostensibly a culture of poverty, which you would argue is really sort of more racialist, in service of the necessary but insufficient argument that you're making?
So if you're asking, like you're talking about like during the Johnson administration,
yeah,
for example, so like programs like Job Corps, which was not without some value, or community action programs, also not without some value, presumed that the hardcore unemployed lacked not just the hard skill sets to gain access to meaningful, gainful employment, but they also lacked the soft skill sets. And so those programs, which again, I don't think were entirely without value, because they do provide, MBTA, I think would be another, they do provide job training, and job training is useful if the jobs are there.
Right.
The problem was that from 1953 or so forward, there was, the US experienced a decline in the number of well-paying jobs for low-skilled workers. And these would be well-paying unionized jobs for low-skilled workers that had been the pathway that working-class whites had taken from the tenements to the suburbs. And so training people for jobs that may or may not exist and don't exist ultimately isn't really the best approach. People like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin and Charles Killingsworth and even W. Willard Wirtz, who was Secretary of Labor, Moynihan was his assistant. They had advocated for public works. I mean, actually taking a page from the book of the New Deal and directly creating jobs that paid well, of course, for low-skilled workers.
And we should say, I think that attitude of that there isn't a structural problem. We just have we need to have a better education. We need to, job training is the solution to unemployment, is, I think, had a lot of durability as an idea, broadly speaking, for society. I mean, I feel like it was discredited a little bit over the past couple of years, frankly. But so what we had was an issue where they were playing around with the inputs. What was really the problem was the function in terms of how we got the outputs.
It's also created problems in the field of education, right? Because, and I read a really good manuscript not long ago on this very topic by a political scientist named Daniel Moak. And in the field of education in the 1960s, the Johnson administration, of course, ponies up lots of money to fund improvements in education. But why did it do so? It did so in part. And I want to stress that federal funds for public education is a good thing. I don't oppose that at all. But the problem with the Johnson administration's effort in that regard was that the end game was to treat education as an economic escalator. That is a problem for teachers in the grand scheme of things, because how could education function to that desired end, right? How could primary and secondary education function in such a way that it could offset the transformation of the economies that children are forced to endure and young adults suffer through, and if those local economies don't have a lot of decent paying jobs? There are profound limits for with respect to what educators can do. And when educators fail to achieve the impossible dream, and it is an impossible dream to burden educations with ending poverty, who do we blame for enduring poverty? We blame public school teachers, as if they're bankrupting America by being remiss in their efforts to make America a fair and equitable society, but they can't, right? And again, we blame public school teachers, and this is the backdrop for high stakes testing and the erosion of public education as a citizenship right.
And so where do you think we are today in terms of society's looking at these questions? I mean, on some level, right, we have, just this week, right, we have incidents like what we saw in Central Park. We have incidents like what we saw in Minnesota. We have these incidents that probably take place, undoubtedly take place on a daily basis. It's just that, we happen to have video of it in these two instances. The reality of racism is there, but in terms of the way that we look at policy to address not necessarily racism, but racial disparities where are we in terms of that, do you think?
Well, I think, like every Black and brown man I know, the Amy Cooper incident sent a chill up my spine, because I've had my own versions of that experience from my teenage years in New Haven, Connecticut, to the workplace as an adult. And I think the Amy Cooper incident, makes plain that racism is with us, which is certainly a point that I make in my book and make everywhere I can, frankly, and that there is a need, and there remains a need, for anti-discrimination policies, which even as such, anti-discrimination policies can't prevent someone like Amy Cooper from doing the despicable thing that she did, but they can certainly have some impact on people's experiences in the workplace. They can have an impact on people's experience in schools. They can have an impact on people who can afford to buy a home in a given community, whether or not they have access to this home. So we absolutely positively, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, need fair housing legislation, which we have, anti-workplace and school discrimination, which we have, and I wouldn't have a problem building on that. But if our end game is to mitigate, let me take mitigate out. If our end game is to eliminate, something known as Black poverty, I'm not sure how we would do that without eliminating poverty in America for everyone. And there are a lot of reasons that I'm not sure how we would do that. The first and most obvious is just math. Blacks are 12.8% of the total population. I don't think there's ever been a time that 12.8% of a population that's comprised disproportionately of working class and poor people has ever won anything in a democracy, right? I mean, you have to have some sort of coalition in order for that's larger than that group to win anything. And that's how it's been, obviously, since emancipation. And that's how it will be as long as Blacks aren't 50+% of the population. So that's our first issue. The other issue, though, that's worth paying attention to is the limitations of anti-discrimination policy as a vehicle for upward mobility, right?
Right.
I absolutely have been a beneficiary of anti-discrimination policy, right? My parents are Black middle-class professionals who bought their first home, I believe, in 1972. So that's about 4 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1968 made it possible for Black people to be homeowners. Both my parents were the beneficiaries of affirmative action, which opened economic opportunities for them, and I, downstream for them, am a beneficiary of it. But if you look at what anti-discrimination policy has done in the absence of a class agenda, Blacks between 1968 and 2016 have actually moved up in relative terms with respect to Black household income. Black household income in 1968, I want to say, was in the 25th percentile. By 2016 or 2018, whatever, it was the 35th percentile. So Blacks had moved up. Why didn't that eliminate the racial wage gap, right, or the wealth gap? Because the earning power of workers, the bottom 80 or 90% of workers, had either remained stagnant or declined. And so Blacks moved up, yes, but they moved up in a context of decline for working people. So the real benefits aren't readily apparent, right? The real benefits for that relative increase, and it's a substantial increase. The earning power for, I believe, the 35th percentile, where Blacks are, at least were before COVID-19, had dropped 30% since 1968. Whites moved up not as far in that context. They moved up from the 55th percentile to the 57th percentile. So they maintained relative advantage over Blacks, but they also continued to experience a decline. If we just focus on disparities, then and ending disparities in this context, that's tantamount to demanding, that's tantamount to demanding a higher berth on a sinking ship.
Right.
That will certainly stave off drowning, but eventually we're still going to drown.
It's a bit of a race to the bottom type of situation.
Yes. And we have to stop the race to the bottom, right? Because it's just not enough to move up in a context of overall decline.
Well, how important is this, is the relationship between race and capitalism to the argument you're making? Because it seems to me it's basically just that the argument you are making is that we have really in many respects two separate problems, and one is the disparity may be a function of racism that exists, because presumably that woman in Central Park, Cooper, it's not just, if she's savvy enough to leverage race in that way, and frankly, I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a clinician, but there's a certain sociopathy involved in that. If she's willing to basically, swat this guy and leverage the fact that he's Black because she knows that that's going to get the cops to come down and terrify him at best, maybe. who knows what she's doing in the workplace, right? I mean, how many black people she's been able to basically, I don't know, keep from advancing or getting any deals with like a similar tactic. But that ultimately, if we're talking about, sort of broad strokes, that there's really has to be two sets of policies that don't even necessarily work in tandem.
Well, I think at least as far as Black and brown people are concerned, they would work in tandem. I think, the origin of affirmative action was part and parcel of an anti-poverty strategy. And for Blacks who were well-positioned, let's say like my parents, to move with the transition from a blue-collar economy to a white-collar economy, affirmative action did quite a bit to mitigate poverty for those Black people. It also did a fair amount for, a stratum of working class people, not all of them, but firemen. An increase in the number of Black firemen and Black cops and detectives and the like in the aftermath. And I'm sure an increase in the number of Black carpenters and electricians in the wake of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So anti-discrimination policies certainly have helped those Black people who were well positioned for white collar employment, but they just are not adequate for those policies, for those Blacks who aren't. And it would be pretty tough for someone who comes from, and it happens, and these are exceptional people, but it's pretty tough or quite a large mountain that we expect poor and working class Black people who, let's say, may come out of households without parents, without parental resources to help them make their way to college, not just financially, but also with respect to, having the kind of education that they could use to help prepare their kids for college. It's to expect poor and working class Black people to transition from, poor neighborhoods with poor quality schools with parents who don't have a lot of formal education to white collar employment. That's not something that white people did, right? That's not something that the principal beneficiaries of, let's say, the National Labor Relations Act did, because those individuals, many of them did not have, we're talking about the 30s, 40s, and even 50s, unionized workforce or a unionized workforce allowed a white population and a stratum of Blacks as well, but allowed a disproportionately large number of whites to transition from, again, the tenements to the suburbs. And what that meant is that those people were paid a wage that afforded them comfort and independence, and the benefits of those wages were accrued by their offspring. And they moved to the suburbs in the post-war era, and their kids attend good quality schools in an era in which public higher education, the tuition in public higher education was either free or unbelievably cheap. And they were able then, their progeny were able to transition into the middle class. There is no mechanism like that for Black people today, right? And other poor and working class people to make that kind of transition today. And what we need is some mechanisms, and we can draw from history for a blueprint for this, but we need some mechanism to assist people who don't have a lot of formal education, whatever their race, to earn good wages that would enable them, again, that would afford them some security and stability and prospects for better life for themselves and their offspring. And so this is a very long-winded way to say that I don't see the anti-discrimination policies and class-centered policies that redress inequities as two fully distinct things, at least for those of us who want to end racial disparities, and I'm one of them. Those things don't exist in worlds apart from each other. They're complementary, and they're essential if we want to live in a more just and democratic society.
Dr. Touré Reed, the book is Toward Freedom, the Case Against Race Reductionism. Thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link to that book at majority.fm. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, folks. Going to head into the fun half. Do we have Michael on the line? Just a reminder, this program relies on your support. You can support this program by going to jointhemajorityreport.com. When you do, we give you extra content every day, and we give you the free show, free of ads. And that's the way we do it around here. If you don't have the resources to become a member and get the extra content, and you don't have to listen to the extra content. Sometimes people just like, I'm going to skip the interview. I'm just going to listen to the fun half today. Or sometimes I'm just going to listen to the interview and not the fun half. However you want to use it. Once you become a member, you can do whatever you want. If you want to listen to just the middle, like I'm going to listen to the last 15 minutes of the interview and the first 15 minutes of the fun half. I mean, it doesn't matter. Flexible in that way. But if you are going through some type of financial stress at this moment, send us an email at majorityreporters@gmail.com. and we will hook you up. No one will be locked out because of finances. So join majorityreport.com or majorityreporters@gmail.com, and we will take care of you. Also, our merch store is open, ladies and gentlemen, and our merch people have been, Brendan, is this fair? Have they been shocked by the response?
They have been, I think shocked is a good way to describe it. They've been very impressed with us and our fan base and their willingness to wear the swag. Yeah.
Yeah. But you
apparently we're doing better than a famous, nonprofit in their merch. So,
well, I mean, come on.
Can I find out about this offline? I want to know who this famous nonprofit is.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And maybe we'll talk about it in the fun half. Join the Majority Report.
Join the Majority Report. Find out who the famous nonprofit is. You can pick up our merch at shop.majorityreportradio.com, and our merch sellers, they were, everything is all American made and all union made, and so and there's obviously in this era of COVID, where our shipping is a little bit slower, and they were a little bit concerned about that. And they're like, do you think people will be okay? And I'm like, people have been waiting 10 years for this merch. I think that would be fine. Also, don't forget amquickie.com every morning. Check it out, 6 minutes long. And justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority, get 10% off. Michael.
Yes, sir.
Look at you.
How are you,
with
Sam?
Beard.
You know, it's getting really serious now.
Yeah.
Very bold mustache.
Yes,
oh, yeah,
believe me, there's a lot of controversy. I don't know if it's going to last the week. It might. It may. I don't know. Maybe it'll last an eternity. But
you have the gall, the chutzpah to do national media with like a 70s porn stash. You got to respect it.
I got a lot of feedback from, I did Hayes's program from this very seat, and I'm going to be on Melber's show, I think maybe tomorrow night. And I'm letting the mustache I may just not, like.
I like it. It'll look like the movie where like Melber's trying to get you to stop gambling.
Right.
And you got
to upgrade your Tinder profile though, Sam.
Right. You can't be misleading.
I'm not sure that would be an upgrade.
Well, you can't be misleading. Last night on TMBS, we did a deep dive. Surprisingly enough, or not surprisingly at all, no one has stepped out of more arms control agreements than the Trump administration. And his arms envoy has said that they are willing to spend China and Russia into an oblivion in a new arms race for the 21st century.
Into an oblivion?
Well, yeah, I guess that's the nice version of what we could do. So we've just stepped out of something called the Open Skies Treaty. So we did a deep dive on the state of arms control and, I mean, what they're doing to completely undermine the entire arms control system. Covered a bunch in the post game, including Iranian oil tankers on their way to Venezuela, and did a great interview with my buddy Dustin Guastalla from the Teamsters and Philly DSA on why Bernie lost and the bigger questions around that, and basically why candidates need to start being seated from labor unions and how that might actually work at a state and local level with some good examples from Pennsylvania. And I'd recommend people read his piece in Jacobin as well. Patreon.com/TMBS.
And folks, don't forget Nomiki's show. You can find it at patreon.com/Nomiki show and also Nomiki Const on YouTube. Check out the Antifada, patreon.com/the Antifada. New content. They load up like 2 or 3 times a week, I think. I'm not sure. Matt, what are you going to be, what game are you going to be playing, and what classic piece of literature will you be listening to?
I am still playing Red Dead Redemption, and people who have followed my recent twitch.tv/literary hangover streams will have read this much of this big book here. This is The Fatal Environment, The Myth of the Frontier and the Age of Industrialization, 1800 to 1890 by Richard Slotkin, name dropped by Cornel West in the TMBS interview, to understand the sort of long line of what you could call fascism in America, and playing Red Dead Redemption to it. So twitch.tv/literary hangover. Very thematically appropriate, I promise.
Which part?
Just
video game is thematically appropriate with the literature, or the literature is thematically appropriate?
The video game set in the late West is thematically appropriate with learning about how, like, the factory and the plantation.
It's like a food and wine pairing.
Exactly, except it's all
it's
about
video
the West.
games and audiobooks.
I tried to read Dostoevsky and listen to Stevie Wonder once. That was an interesting pairing.
I actually listened. I listened to Chopped and Screwed Chameleonaire while reading Brave New World in high school.
That totally works. that is, I would almost 1-to-1 actually.
I would like to see you play the game and literally read the book simultaneously out loud. All right, folks. See you in the fun half. 646-257-3920, or you can IM us on the IM. Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous? You're a little bit upset? You're riled up?
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude. You want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
That's a good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 2, 38, 56, 27. 1/2. 5 8s. 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy.
Dance, dance, dance.
Ooh.
Rand Paul. I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America.
You.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook.
throw our hands up.
Ooh. Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey, shut up.
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.
Oh, we are back, ladies and gentlemen. It's the fun half. The IM machine is back up. The phones are working. Michael is here. Michael, how are things?
It's still pretty intense here in Brooklyn. Still extremely limited mobility. So you stay in the apartment and read articles about how the administration and the New York governor let the virus spread. And then you put on a mask, take a little run, and then get back inside and, wash your hands for 5 minutes. This is not excellent time. I mean, there's a minor complaint, but if you already have any inclination towards being slightly OCD, not helpful times. But all things being equal, obviously, thankfully, everybody is okay. So
I have.
It's still really intense here. I mean, I think just because this is getting normalized, we're at 100,000 and everything else. Like, it's awful, and we're not even going to obviously know accurate numbers anywhere, let alone in New York, for quite some time.
Yeah, I think so. I have a friend. His name will go nameless. I don't know that people would recognize it, or maybe they would. In college, he had this habit of constantly putting Carmex on his lips, and that went away, and I'd forgotten about it until I was FaceTiming with him, and every 5 minutes he is putting Purell on his hands, and I'm like, dude, right. What are you doing? I've watched you. There's no way that you could have had any other germs on your hands because you've been FaceTiming with me, sitting at your kitchen table. And it's I think people are developing those habits. My son is now very good about washing his hands, though.
That's good.
But the thing that really bothers me is like when people go out there and they act so politically correct by wearing a mask. And thank goodness the president has called people out on this. Here is Donald Trump. He's being asked why he criticized Joe Biden for wearing a mask. And this is the weird part. Well, there's a couple weird parts here, but Trump does not seem to understand that if you're in a pod, as it were, whatever people are calling it, you call it a pod, like your quarantine group. That could be one other person.
I see what you mean. Yeah. I've never heard that before. But yes, if you're around, sure. You don't have to wear it around your family
or your girlfriend or your child or whatever. You don't need to wear a mask if you're indoors with them because you guys are in the same boat anyways, right? Trump doesn't seem to understand that. Listen to this question.
Yeah, please.
Mr. President, two questions about a couple of things you've tweeted about in the last few days. Were you meaning to criticize Vice President Biden for wearing a mask yesterday? And can you explain why you've been tweeting about a conspiracy theory that has been proven to not be true?
No, Biden can wear a mask, but he was standing outside with his wife, perfect conditions, perfect weather. They're inside, they don't wear masks. And so I thought it was very unusual that he had one on. But I thought that was fine. I wasn't criticizing him at all. Why would I ever do a thing like that? And your second question was...
That's a classic Trump,
it's a very good...
I'm going to criticize him, but I'm not criticizing him.
Bloomberg can have a stool. I'm not judging him if he has a stool.
Look, there's nothing wrong. Maybe he should have a box, but why should he have a box? That was
But he's trying to make it like Biden's just posturing with his mask.
Hypocrite.
Like he's a hypocrite because he doesn't wear it on the inside, but presumably when Joe Biden goes out of his house, there's other people around, not just his wife, right? Like we know that Joe Biden went out because obviously there was reporters there. And so there must have been at least at the minimum reporters around. And maybe that's why you wear the mask. Like if you're alone in I don't know, walking down the street with someone that you're living with, I can see why you would have your mask maybe around your neck or something like that, as opposed to over your face. But if there's reporters around, I wonder if he doesn't understand the dynamic of that.
That's what I think. Trump is stupid, is overblown, and it's not a good way of dealing with him, frankly, because I think that approach has not been effective. There's certainly some method to his madness, but this one is genuinely, I mean, I don't even, is he actually not grasping the basic concept here, or is he so committed to feeding a certain strain of his base that he's just butchering it?
I think it's both.
I
think he's so committed, and he's just too lazy to come up with like a good reason to make it. He's just trying to point out wimp for wearing a mask.
Yeah, I mean, inside the air isn't even circulating.
But
it doesn't make any sense.
Ask him about they ask him about the whole theory that existed for a long time that Joe Scarborough was involved in the death of one of his interns or something like that. Here we go.
Had one on, but I thought that was fine. I wasn't criticizing him at all. Why would I ever do a thing like that? And your second question was, I couldn't hear you. Can you take it up because I cannot hear you?
I'll just speak louder, sir.
Okay, good. You want to be politically correct. Go ahead.
No, sir. I just want to wear the mask.
By wearing a mask.
The second question was about your tweets about the woman who died, who you're suggesting that Joe Scarborough was responsible.
Yeah, a lot of people suggest that, and hopefully someday people are going to find out. It's certainly a very suspicious situation, very sad and very suspicious. Question, please.
Now, I feel bad for the guys, for the woman who died's husband, who's been just like, please stop using the death of my wife. And this happened like, I don't know, 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago.
Very long time ago.
As some type of like political cudgel. But, as far as Joe Scarborough, Joe Scarborough did a lot of cheerleading for Donald Trump when he was running for office. And
I mean,
he could take care
Joe
of
Scarborough should say that this is a great part of Donald Trump's wacky, unconventional personality, and you never know where he's going to go.
Right.
I mean, that should be Joe Scarborough's response. Yeah, he's in on the joke. He sees it. I mean, he's so in on the joke that when he was tweeting this out, and I did genuinely find this hilarious, that in the middle of accusing the guy of murdering an intern and calling him a psycho, he also definitely had to point out that Morning Joe's ratings are very low.
Yeah.
And if that doesn't tell you that he's in on the joke and having a good time, I don't know what does. So I think Joe Scarborough should have, I mean, look, he can push back, he can fight back, but just in the same way that the guy with muscular dystrophy, and it wasn't muscular, the guy who Donald Trump mocked for having a muscle spasm. I don't remember. And Joe Scarborough could barely contain himself on air. Some of us have the decency to laugh like that off air about these Trump material. Scarborough should take it in stride and relax a little bit.
Right. It is fascinating how wearing a mask has now become like a cultural signifier for the right, or not wearing a mask has become a cultural signifier for the right. I mean, that is fascinating to me.
I've seen like normal sort of non-ideological people, mainly on Facebook, but they make jokes about, like, I saw a person wearing a mask in their car, what an idiot, and that sort of thing. It's like, who cares if they just kept the mask on after they got in their car? Like,
I mean, the mask in the car is silly, but you don't need it in the car.
But like,
if you're
who
alone,
cares? But
right?
like, if that's what you're emphasizing, it's kind of giving away like where you're going with it, right? Like, if that's what you keep talking about, I don't know. I think that's that's why Trump's making this joke about Biden, is there's a whole culture of these sorts of jokes now.
Without a doubt. And that's why Fauci is doing the opposite, where he's saying, like, it's important to signal to people that wearing a mask does not make you a wimp. I mean, I can't even believe in the middle of a pandemic that there would be anything that's happening with our government or our elected leaders that brings me to the point of actually having to articulate those words I just articulated. But here is Anthony Fauci on CNN talking about why it's important to wear a mask for I think for like public figures when they go on, when they're out and about, because it's communicating the importance of it.
You're completely correct.
All 50 states are opening to some degree, some variance within that, but taking steps across the country. As they open, wearing masks is recommended for people to help reduce the spread. In your view, does it make a difference to encourage that when public servants set an example by wearing a mask, as you often do when you appear in public?
Well, Jim, I think we certainly should be recommending it. I mean, as you know, I wear it whenever I'm outside, and we can try and keep the usual distance, but sometimes it's out of your control. So there are some fundamental things that we can do. We're very aware of and sensitive to the need to try and make those steps towards reopening. But there are certain things that you can do and still do as you're reopening. One of them is wearing a mask. The other is avoiding crowds of more than 10 people, depending upon where you are and where the dynamics of the outbreak are. The other is continuing to wash your hands, which is important. And those kinds of things are simple. They're easy to do. And I think one can do that at the same time as you're gradually trying to get to the point of doing a reopening. And I think those are the things that everybody should seriously consider doing.
Do you think when folks, members of the public, are being asked to do this, and they look at folks like you doing it, does that encourage its use to a positive degree?
No, it does, Jim. And I mean, I wear it for the reason that I believe it is effective. It's not 100% effective. I mean, it's sort of respect for another person and have that other person respect you. You wear a mask, they wear a mask, you protect each other. I mean, I do it when I'm in the public for the reasons that, A, I want to protect myself and protect others, and also because I want to make it be a symbol for people to see that that's the kind of thing you should be doing. And when
how much what?
What a pussy.
Well, what world are we living in that the top medical advisor who is sort of leading our pandemic response has to go on and do this kabuki theater with this CNN host who's also doing this kabuki theater? We know who they're talking about, right? This is all like one big subtweet that the president of the United States is trying to make trying to create a culture war over the use of masks during a pandemic. It's effing nuts. It's just, I know every day we have another example of how insane, the Mad King is. But like, if we were to drop from like sometime in 2015 and like someone to parachute in on May 27th, 2020, and like, oh, there's a pandemic going on. What are you talking about? Oh, we're talking about how you're not some type of wussy if you wear a mask, or you're not politically too PC. What? What do you mean? It's a pandemic, right? They were wearing masks in 1918 when people were really soft.
Right. When people were really soft. Yeah. I mean, of course. It's interesting to track. I think there are some people on the right, a small minority, that have taken this seriously consistently, and they either are interested in survivalist stuff or the fixation with China, and that's something to track. But the other part, and I think there are maybe some people, and I don't feel happy about this at all, but I think as this just starts to hit, like we saw in Alabama, maybe we'll get to later, like their numbers are starting to skyrocket. There are going to be parts of his coalition that are going to turn on this because, it's happening and people they know are dying. Maybe they're dying, maybe they're getting ill. But then the other kind of shift it's really extraordinary to watch some people who, 3 months ago, and I think, look, 3 months ago, the CDC and others were still saying masks weren't necessary and everything else. I think probably, frankly, because I'm sure there wasn't the supply. So right. You're not going to go out and say that you should do this when there isn't a supply. So there's a lot of problems. But, people have shifted from this is the China Democrat virus. It's the most serious thing in the world, to now it's the wuss bag mask wearing society. And we're not going to be contained.
How long is it going to be until we have and maybe this is happening right now, Steven Crowder is out there talking about soy boys wearing masks type of situation.
Surprised it hasn't happened yet.
I mean, it may have. I don't know. I have not.
I think he will do that video once he feels absolutely safe from the virus, and they figured out how to edit all the takes where he's wearing a mask out of the footage.
Well, yeah, Crowder. Steven Crowder doesn't need a mask; he needs a warm pair of socks. So.
Cold feet Crowder.
Cold feet.
Crowder.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah, that's you know what? That's right. There's a lot of risks you can take to prove your manhood, like debate this guy with the mustache.
Exactly. Calling from a 308 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hey, it's Kowalski. Can you hear me?
Kowalski in Nebraska. What's happening, Kowalski? What's the story? Are you, if you wear a mask out in the heartland, as it were, are you considered soft?
Well, I don't think anybody would probably call me that to my face, but dynamic.
Love it.
Not many people are going to call the 6'5", 250-pound man soft.
Dipset.
It's not a good idea.
All right, fair enough.
Hey, the reason I called in was actually to touch a little bit on what your interview was about, dealing with poverty and whatnot, and how like parents and stuff help with that. But basically, I came to the realization a few weeks ago that this whole pandemic kind of reminds me of when I used to be rather poor. So like, you hear a lot of people complaining about not going to movie theaters, not going out to restaurants and stuff. And, you know, it doesn't really bother me. And I think it's because, you know, like when you grow up poor, you don't really have those options anyways. And you kind of know how to be a little tough during hardships. And I think it's quite clear when you look at people who are making a lot of policy decisions that they have never at any point have endured hardship in their life, and their lack of empathy really does show.
I think it becomes a lot more clear. I mean, I know I've harped on this quite a bit, but I still can't get that interview that Nancy Pelosi gave, where it was like the big, you know, problem was like, how do we have enough ice cream for all the folks in our house who all want different flavors? And I want to just, you know, like write it off as a political miscalculation, but I mean, like you really need to have a tin ear to sort of like, this is going to ingratiate me with people. It just seems, I don't know, pretty crazy.
The only political calculation on that is the absolute fixation that they genuinely have for affluent suburban districts. That's the only tactic I could see in play there. But I just to jump in real quick, guys, I think I say this, I'm a broken record, but Bill Clinton, same policy sets, would never, I mean, yes. They wouldn't. I mean, it's just the complete. Now, a part of me wants to say that because there is this very clear calculation that these suburban districts are really only who she's interested in talking to. But that being said, the Clintons were interested in talking to those districts too. They wouldn't do something that would just completely visually alienate a vast amount of the country. So the fact that there is not even anybody in these offices saying, Mrs. Speaker, Madam Speaker, that's a disaster. No, let's not like, let's go to your guest house and pretend that's where you live. Let's go. I mean, it's just incredible.
Just pretend that you can't get ice cream and say like, that's the one thing I miss. Like, I mean, like just to open up that thing. I don't know. I mean, I think, yes, it's
extraordinary
inability to just even do like basic politics.
You know what it is? It's Kowalski. It's empathy in the sense you're saying, but it's also Robert Wright talks about cognitive empathy, which doesn't even necessarily mean that, you know, warm decency and feeling. It just means the ability to intellectually grasp where other people might be coming from.
Yeah. Bill Clinton had a great ability to project sincerity.
Yes. or have a thought of other
Another
people's
thing I
thought
wanted to talk
process.
about with your go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
Go
Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the materialistic conditions that are kind of necessary to pull people out of poverty. Because one thing that I know of is, like, I have no doubt my life would have went in a hugely different direction if my uncle hadn't, like, stepped up to give my siblings and I more opportunity to be able to come back to the farm and whatnot and have a way out. And if you do not have, like, financial means at all, it doesn't really matter what educational opportunities are put before you. You cannot succeed. Like, it is virtually impossible. And this is coming from, you know, a white, heterosexual Protestant male who's big, tall, strong, blonde hair, blue eyes, pretty much every cultural, like, condition you could have to give you an advantage. And it still isn't enough without, like, some sort of externality to assist you. So, like, if we ever want to address poverty on a grand scale, it has to be, you know, like, a huge thing that addresses it for everybody. Like, if you don't understand that dynamic at all, I don't even really see how you can be a leader.
Well, you need a floor that will allow you to take risks of some nature or another, so that you can actually climb out of poverty, which means that, like, you can't be worried that if I go and get this job, I have no childcare. You can't be worried that if I spend the money on the car to go get the job, I'm not going to be able to buy food for the kids. You can't be worried that if you do X, Y, or Z, you're going to lose your health care. There has to be a basic there has to be a commodification of a certain amount of our necessities, so that people can sort of take some even small risks on improving their lot.
Even in addition to
that, and it's not only that, like, there's clearly enough resources to go around to prevent people from suffering. Like, one dynamic that I think your guys' show has helped me put into perspective is, like, the nature of how capital is set up is to create artificial poverty, which, you know, when you have that dynamic, you create scarcity. But the problem with that is that, like, even if it does create innovation, it kills people. Like, my mother worked herself to death, literally trying to provide for us. And I don't really see how that is, like, a benefit to anybody in the grand scheme of things. Because, I mean, dead is dead. You don't enjoy anything at that point. And I just think that it is a complete waste of everybody's, like, existence to have to just, you know, work every single day. And I mean, that's the dynamic we're seeing now with people wanting to get back to work. It's not because they want to, it's because they have to. And the people of privilege want everything turned back on so they can go back to their concerts or movie theaters or whatever.
I think,
thanks for the call.
Yeah, that was great. And I you know, and what Touré, thanks, man. You know, and I think what Touré is pointing to in the policy sets that I think we also support just have nothing, you know, there's certain things that just are on the house. They just have nothing. They should just be completely disentangled from any type of accomplishment, frankly. Housing, healthcare, food. And we can have, and I think there's also, I think the other thing that's important is that there's a whole bunch of people who don't even necessarily have this fixation on quote unquote moving up. You know, maybe they grew up, they liked the jobs their parents did. They liked that their parents were able to make a decent living being firemen or construction workers. And they would actually like to be able to do the same thing. It's good work. They want to make a good living. They don't feel the need to attempt to, you know, go to an Ivy League school or whatever else. And this whole other idea that those are the only people we reward. I mean, first of all, that it doesn't solve poverty at all, and that it's only going to apply to a small section of people who actually can do that. But even beyond that, a lot of people don't have that fixation, and nor should they have to have that fixation. There's plenty of great and deeply necessary work that needs to be done that has nothing to do with, you know, getting those advanced degrees, and should be treated with respect monetarily and culturally.
Calling from a 859 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hello, Sam. My name is Corey from Maryland. How are you?
I'm well, Corey from Maryland. What's on your mind?
So, as a context, I have to put this in context because I am Asian American. I'm specifically from South Korea, adopted. And lately I've just noticed that throughout this entire pandemic, I keep seeing so many people who are all on the liberty train, as it were. They keep talking about oppression and internment. And I have had no less than 15 conversations where at the end of it, it always ends up in them talking about how stay-at-home orders is just like Japanese internment. And as I've just gone on other forms of social media, it's expanded even past that. You're seeing people hold up signs talking about slavery and all of it, and slavery and like police states and all of this. And it just seems very disheartening. And even with the states lifting all of their stay-at-home orders, it doesn't seem to be getting better. It seems to be increasing. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's bat crap crazy. I mean, like, honestly, like it's very hard to read this stuff and watch it on a daily basis and not think like, it's time to roll this thing up. Interesting experiment, but didn't work out. And let's cut up the country in a couple of different ways and, be done with it. I mean, honestly, like I think, the conservative mindset is fueled by a sense of aggrievement. Always, in every context, it is always aggrievement that sort of they are fed and that they nourish on. And it is, and this is, there's some, like, I'm being punished by the pandemic. I mean, the president says it. He projects this, and I think, I mean, it sucks. Everybody is suffering. Some are suffering far more than others. And it is one thing to say, like, we need more support from our government by way of, some type of job security or security that we're going to have health care or whatever it is. But it's another to say, like, this is some form of oppression. It's absurd. It really is absurd. I don't even know how to process it beyond that. But
a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice actually used internment in a hearing on it. I mean, it's not just, crazy people on social media.
It's crazy people on the
Wisconsin Supreme Court too.
Hang in there, Corey. And I would suggest that you get different Facebook friends. All right, bye-bye.
Well, thankfully, they're not my friends.
All right, well, that's good. I mean, it's a good way to sort of determine who it is that you want to be friends with. Fortunately, the private sector, Michael, as you know, is saving us from this COVID-19 despair. Here is Steve Doocy talking about how the wonders of COVID-19. And again, it's like, I think to a large extent, the reason why there is all this relaxing going on is a function of pressure from, Chamber of Commerce types, Mercer, Koch brothers, Koch brother on Donald Trump, and this sort of sense of like getting the economy going. But we will find out, like, the cost will be externalized, right? The cost will be societies.
Right.
Play this clip. It's number 4.
I was thinking, Ainsley and Brian, this morning, whether it is the SpaceX launch later today or the race for a vaccine, while the government is involved, for the most part, we're looking at private enterprise in both the private sector. Capitalism is putting us back in space, and capitalism is part of the race for a vaccine. Ainsley?
You're right, because SpaceX, owned by Elon Musk, this is amazing. This is the first time in about 10 years that we have launched from American soil. This is a private company. They've been preparing for this for 6 years now, and they're going to do it for the first time today. They did a dress rehearsal last year, but this is the first time that humans have been launched from a private company up into space.
I mean, God knows how much of that technology that is being employed there is a function of U.S. tax dollars. I mean,
Elon Musk's real talent is getting U.S. contracts. He is a master of getting U.S. government investment, essentially, for, I would say, a pretty mixed record. This is so basic, though, that this is the type of segment that makes me a little bit optimistic. It's almost like if everything is completely failing, I don't know what to say. Like, it's sort of like if you and I just sat down and we're like, but it still is kicking in is Social Security. Isn't that great? At a time where in this ridiculous hypothetical I'm painting, say Sanders is president and the wheels are just falling off completely and there's a pandemic and none of the policies are working and the signals were not in place and everything's a disaster. And then finally, after months of spinning, we're just like, what's good? Social Security. I mean, we would still be more right, but it's just so basic. I don't know. They've got no material.
Right. But the problem is that there's really not many voices out there saying, we got SpaceX going up in the air and there's a big kudos to the taxpayer because 84% of all the technology used in SpaceX was actually developed with tax dollars. Here's another story. It just happened to come out, Washington Post. This drug, remdesivir, maybe remdesivir. Maybe I'm not saying it.
I think
correctly.
you're in the ballpark.
It is put out. It is owned by Gilead Sciences. This is, I think, an Israeli company. And I don't know if they're Israeli or not, but I guess it must be an American company because they had this drug. It had been sort of like shelved. A scientist convinced the company about 7 years ago to assemble a library of 1,000 cast-off molecules and search for medicines to treat emerging viruses. Okay, so this is where this drug came from, I should say. And the drug was just sort of sitting in the mothballs. They'd shelved it. I'm not exactly sure how they develop drugs, but Gilead, this scientist said, let me work on this drug because I think it could have some antiviral help. This is about 7 years ago. There were 3 federal health agencies that were deeply involved in remdesivir's development on every step of the way, providing tens of millions of dollars of government research to support. And despite the fact that there were these massive subsidies, federal agencies have not asserted patent rights to Gilead's drug, potentially a blockbuster therapy worth billions of dollars. So not only, look, I got no problem with the U.S. government not participating necessarily in profits to this, although I think they should exert their patent rights so that we can say this drug, you will make 10% profit on this. You will make 8% profit on this. But if it turns out to be a drug that's going to help with the therapy of coronavirus, we invested in it, we created it, tax dollars, and you're going to make it available for, X number of dollars or whatever it is. You're going to give us, the American government, X amount of doses, whatever it is. All of this story gets repeated over and over and over again, where public resources go into creating profit for private enterprise at the expense of not just the expense that it cost us to develop it, but then at the expense of the rest of society. We get hit on both ends.
I would say, to me, I agree completely, but I do want a stake of that profit. It's a public-private partnership. If this is how we're going to operate, then the profits are going to be shared, frankly, by both institutions. And in addition to that, someone said this, I forget who, but I like this reframing of pharmaceutical companies. It's like, look, of course they have R&D and of course they have scientists. But if you factor in the amount of public research investment that these companies' models are built on, you can more accurately think of them not as science, biology, and medicine companies, but as branding, advertising, and patent consortiums.
Right.
And that's what they're doing. They are taking literal public commons, privatizing them, and then taking it out of the hands of people. I mean, this is just cartel stuff. There isn't even a market argument inside this. It's cartel. It's pure. It's privatize the public commons, make benefits for shareholders, and then pay off the political system. That's it.
Socialize the costs, privatize the profit. Anthony Cadolifenthil. I just called to say left is best. Lady in red. Okay. Simple Socialist. Sam, a little confused at the tone of the interview today. It seemed like you were approaching it as a hostile interview, though I may be reading a bit much into it. I was just wondering what you disagreed with specifically. Not that I think he was 100% right, just wondering on the opposite take. Part of it was that I was getting an echo back in the first part of the interview, but I was also just trying to get at like the nub of it. I mean, because maybe part of it is just I'm not as conscious of, I didn't perceive the revision on history's revisionist take on the New Deal as being as comprehensive, I think, as he did. So I couldn't, like, I mean, I think there was racism involved in the New Deal. But it doesn't mean that I don't think it didn't benefit Black people. I mean, I think it benefited a lot of people. I think it's just from a political standpoint where industry was most successful in sort of keeping the New Deal from infringing upon, its desire to maintain its money. I think racism was like the weakest place for them to operate on. The underbelly. But
I watched it. I watched the interview, and I'm a, very big fan of Touré Reed. Very, very big fan, and obviously Adolph Reed too. I didn't perceive it as hostile. I didn't perceive it as hostile at all. But I think though that just there's a lot to it, and I really would recommend everybody read the book. But I think the takeaway that there's a line of scholarship critiquing the New Deal for not being fully universal across the board, including along means of race, versus another line that says because it wasn't, therefore means we cannot do universals, leads to extremely different conclusions about policy.
Yeah, and I think that's
what he's speaking. That's important.
And that's more among leftists, I think, than maybe an impression you would have, Sam.
And certain it's among certain leftists, and I guess amongst certain, God, these terms are just all so overused, but like neoliberal liberals. Like he explains in the book, not to open up another thing, but he explains how, he has a chapter specifically critiquing Ta-Nehisi Coates and Obama, and among many other things, he explains that Ta-Nehisi Coates doesn't really appear to understand what universal programs means, because he's writing about things that are means tested. And so, anyways, it's just I think
in terms of he credits Obama with a universality,
right? Which is not universal.
Yes, and yes, and he has a critique of reparations as being just sort of like a one and done type of situation that is not helpful in terms of the structural problems. But like I guess maybe I'm not. I think like I'm not as aware of his book. It seems to me is a critique of an existing line of thought that I am not as conscious as being dominant as maybe.
That's funny because I definitely think it's my experience is that it's extremely dominant. But I think the other thing too that I liked in the book really is just a complete allergy to any type of culturalist explanation, and that real weaving of racist narratives of a so-called underclass and trying to make questions of poverty and deindustrialization and discrimination questions of cultural practices or personal responsibility.
Right.
I think that's a really important area. but it's also important to debunk it just across the board.
Do you think people like celebrate Daniel Moynihan anymore?
Well, no, but I think the way he kind of talks about how those narrative structures have changed. Like it's like a architecture. It's being used in it to deploy different arguments now than it was in the 70s, but the underlying structure is still in place.
Local pizza historian Sam Stash is a PSA that Q was a coach before it was a non. 2014 playoff, baby.
I don't know what that means.
I don't understand that one either. Max and BK. Hey, Sam, I just graduated from law school, so I'd very much like one of those Jew horns. Okay.
Congratulations.
Here you go. After the comment, please. When I listen to the Reeds discuss the New Deal, I'm reminded of all the Supreme Court cases I've read where they bend over backwards to discount or minimize the effect racism has. There's even a test called intent versus effects you may be familiar with. Anyway, there's a whole host of current issues, environment, health, etc., that correlate more strongly with race than anything else. P.S. Tell Mike I said hi. Don't forget the horn. Already did the horn.
Got the horn.
I mean, my sense is that at least Touré was not discounting that element. He was just saying that to attribute all of it to that is wrong.
I think not only is he saying that, and I do think that the other aspect of the argument is that there may be areas where, like, the overall story of deindustrialization cannot be told through race. And that there's almost every variable can have a class component, but not every single variable necessarily is a race component. I think that's another part of it too. But it's very important that people recognize that, the book in no way discounts racism or disparities. It's looking at how things come about and trying to address it more effectively. So you're already in a different type of argument than anybody. I mean, anybody that would deny disparities just isn't credible,
Bang Bang Bart. Hi, Sam. Fantastic interview with Reed today. Boy, I'll tell you, everybody's all over the place with this. I've been following the actions of an anti-Olympics group in LA and the close work they've been doing with tenants unions over the vacant houses for homeless families that are protesting at Garcetti's mansion. Professor and former athlete Jules Boykoff just wrote a book about them. He and Zyron have been doing great coverage of the international anti-Olympics movement and its recent response to COVID and the canceled 2020 Tokyo Games. Think you guys could get someone on the show into this? Thanks. I remember maybe it was a year ago, I interviewed somebody from the No LA Games. I can't remember exactly who it was, but let's go to the phones. Calling from an 847 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
It's Josh from Chicago.
Josh from Chicago. How are you, Josh? Hanging in there?
Good. I'm good. How are you? That was an enthusiastic greeting.
Well,
appreciate it.
Talk about the last dance, not harebrained DNC schemes, and everybody will stay happy.
The last dance was fucking awesome.
Amazing.
Anyway, no, I wanted to talk about two things. First, I've noticed from the people I've seen who aren't wearing masks, and this is from being in Chicago, near where my parents live, a lot of people who aren't wearing masks, and particularly the people who aren't wearing masks in the neighborhoods that they live in, tend to be like upper class it corresponds with like neighborhoods that are upper class or wealthier. And I think there are real class dynamics here about like why people aren't wearing masks. Whenever I've sort of rode my bike in sort of more working class neighborhoods, the people I see out on the street tend to be wearing masks. And I think it's partially to do with the fact that a lot of these people aren't wearing masks. If they get sick, it's not that big a deal to them because they don't have to worry about going bankrupt for medical bills. It's certainly not science, but I do think there are definitely like big class dynamics here in terms of when people wear masks or when people don't wear masks.
I think there may be.
I've noticed.
I think there may be some geographic idiosyncrasies too to this, because I can tell you in my experience, I'm in a more rural area at the moment, and I can tell you that it is 80% of the people that I come across who don't wear masks, or I see don't wear masks, are men, and they are working class in some fashion or another. Like,
toxic masculinity plays a huge part.
I honestly think that there's a decent amount of that. But with that said, I don't see a lot, because I think like the close proximity to New York, people have a greater sensitivity to what's going on. But
I'd say where I am, pretty much everybody wears a mask, and the only distinction I could find, and maybe I'm too easy on this, than I would be otherwise, but it just is what it is like teenagers,
Yeah.
and that makes a lot of sense. Like, and I'm not entirely convinced that if I was 14, I wouldn't be an idiot about it myself. But everybody else,
my daughter's very responsible, and with her friends are very responsible.
Everybody else is wearing it.
Water boat. Thanks, Josh. Stay safe. Water boat from Kashmir. Hello, MR family. Lots happening in Kashmir for an IM, from changing domicile laws to extrajudicial murders of innocents in the name of fighting insurgents to actual battles with insurgents. Thousands still languish in jails without charge or laughably fabricated charges. There's so much more and so overwhelming that I wouldn't know where to begin, so I'll leave it here. However, what should concern the world, even if it doesn't care about human rights, is that things are heating up militarily. A division of Chinese army has crossed and encamped in an Indian-administered Kashmir from east along the disputed border with India. Yes, you heard it right. The Chinese. This while Pakistani military leadership stated officially for the first time on Sunday that any attempt by India to unilaterally change the status of the dispute will be met by force, meaning ethnic cleansing through demographic change will not be accepted. This in the same month where the fascist government in India has vocally made demographic change in Kashmir a centerpiece of Indian foreign and domestic policy with support from opposition parties. Liberals are disgusting everywhere. I leave to your imagination the disaster that awaits. We are in a constant Cuban missile crisis, which is getting worse every day these days, while a brutal occupation gets more brutal. Keep Kashmir in your thoughts, and pray, if you pray, in your prayers. Jeez. Oy.
I think the last war, China and India fought a war, I think in 1962 about that area. And yeah, China getting involved in that, because there's obviously always the dimension of India and Pakistan, but China and Pakistan have cultivated a really tight relationship. And if, China sees this as an opportunity to make some gains territorially with this Indian government, that is definitely the most dangerous area in the world today. There's no doubt about it. And the human rights situation is obscene.
Let's go to the phones. Calling from a 360 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from? 360. Going once. 360. Going twice. 360. Back into the queue. Back into the queue.
Goodbye.
Calling from a 491 area code. What is this?
Is this me?
Yeah. Who's this?
Hi, this is Tom from Germany.
Tom from Germany. Back off your phone a little bit, Tom, because your German technology is so far superior to the U.S. that it's actually too loud. So just back up just a little bit.
How's that?
That's great. What's on your mind?
So I was listening to the interview with Dr. Touré, and what really stood out to me was what he talked about towards the end of how people with limited means to elevate lower class.
Oh, not too far away, Tom. Bring your phone back into a little closer to where you are.
Yeah, how's that?
That's great.
Stay right there.
Yeah, so, and similar to what Kowalski was talking about, of, people who are lower class, finding it difficult to elevate to the middle class. I think it's kind of by design. So I'm over here in the military, and it's pretty clear how...
Well, bring your phone back to your mouth, buddy.
Yeah, the system is orchestrated to kind of target people who don't have a means of escaping their current situation. So the military is really like the best welfare system that the U.S. has to offer.
100%.
Yes.
So,
yep.
I distinctly remember in 2008 or 9 hearing a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was in the wake of the financial crisis, hearing like 2 conversations within the context of like a couple of days, right by our old office, where a guy was saying, Kevin went back into, he was saying to another guy about his son. He went back into, he signed up for another tour because he had no other options.
Yep.
And it was the only way to make money.
Yep.
Absolutely. And what a lot of people don't realize is how, the system of the military is extremely well designed to, one, recruit people who have a difficult means of, escaping, whether it's because of poverty or because of poor educational systems, but even more so, it's perfectly designed to keep people in. So you don't, they'll give you an education, they'll teach you a job, regardless of whether it's being a cook or punching numbers into a computer for finances, or if it's pulling a trigger or driving a tank. But then also they're going to make sure that you have free childcare, that if you stay in for 3 years, you can go to college for free. If you get money to be able to pay for all of your food. Credit cards can't hold you at high interest rates. It's limited to 6%, regardless of how much debt you're in or what your limit is. And that's understood by kind of the entire structure. And so it's really unfortunate in my mind of, the only means that America and the government can kind of bless off on to allow people to elevate and to allow such a welfare state to kind of exist is if you're willing to put your life on the line and go fight their wars, which then you add in like the revelations from the Afghanistan papers, and
right.
You have these people look retrospectively. I mean, I'm getting out of the Army in about 2 weeks, and so you kind of look back on it, retrospectively, you say, "Gosh, I can't believe what I got sent to do," and it's pretty. It just rang really true of like, yeah, America can't sign off on the structural changes necessary to allow average Americans and everyday Americans to not, have to go to the lengths of, hey, go get sent overseas, put your life in danger, and then, maybe we'll think about giving you a support system to allow you.
Touré touches on this in his book too.
To thrive.
Because Touré talks about how the military was actually pushed as part of these culturalist policy prescriptions. The idea that underclass folks that, supposedly didn't have these values to function in capitalism or whatever could learn them in the military. So this actually links directly. Yeah.
But I would also argue that I have no doubt, and I don't know how ubiquitous this is, but there is no doubt a consciousness that if we as a society offer the benefits or anything like any reasonable facsimile to what is being offered in the military, we're going to have tough time fielding an army, certainly, any type of military across the board, obviously not just the Army, but we're going to have a tough time fielding a military that is commensurate with the requirements that we demand of our empire.
We're not going to have an underclass empire, and the fight, and the answer to that, right, is one, of course, roll back the empire, but the other one, and it's provocative, is the idea of some sort of mandatory service that cuts across class lines. I'm not, and I mean, I don't.
And then people start questioning your military adventurism a lot more.
Right.
Well,
absolutely.
Well, hang in there, and
I do have one other thing. I recently read a book. George Friedman wrote a book called Storm Before the Calm. He's written a number of kind of geopolitical assessments, and I don't know, I think he fancies himself as kind of a geopolitical prophet, and there's a ridiculous amount of whitewashing in the beginning of the book. I'm kind of setting the stage, but he does talk about he kind of posits that there's a cyclical nature of inside the U.S. government, both from an economic perspective and from a political perspective, and that in 2030 really is the first time in the U.S.'s history that that both of those cycles are occurring at the same time, and so it might be something worth listening to. Or
2030 is which cycles that it will be happening?
But yeah, both the economic cycle and the political cycle. So if I have it correctly, the political cycle is roughly every 50 years. There are significant shifts. So you talked a lot about Reagan coming in and the shift of the Republican Party into this kind of a America First and patriotism and fighting the communists and et cetera. And then from a financial perspective and the economic perspective, the post-industrial society, the rise of the technocrats, and kind of how that's going to be played out. So, I mean, he has his ways that he thinks it's going to play out, but it's certainly interesting looking at what's going on now, whether it be Trump or the failure of the Democrats to kind of rise up against it and to have a unified action against what I think most people think is pretty reprehensible, and that being more of a institutional problem versus a personality problem,
right?
Whether it's the speaker or Trump himself or any of those folks. So I don't know. That was interesting.
Interesting stuff. All right. Well, appreciate the call.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Leaving in 2 weeks. Good luck, man.
Yeah, it's pretty good. You know, we though have been lucky, and our caller was pretty lucky, apparently, Michael, because he has been able to grow up in an era with a semblance of freedom because, of course, we've been fighting all these wars in the Middle East. And how did I gain this incredible wisdom? Well, from Brian Kilmeade.
Oh,
on Fox and
he's a Middle East scholar, right?
Yeah.
Michael, I'll tell you, just a real quick point for people who say that we're just a police force. Have there been hits on our country since 9/11 from that region? The answer is no, because of the great work people like you did over there on a regular basis, giving a whole generation a chance to grow up with some semblance of freedom so they can make their own choices.
No, that's absolutely right, Brian. And look at what happened when ISIS was flourishing and inspiring attacks all over the United States. And then when the president came in and said enough, destroyed the caliphate, They're on their back foot. And as long as those leaders are worried about missiles coming through their window at night, they're not plotting and planning against the United States. It's the same thing in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, I think that's going to be the case for the foreseeable future with a small presence. We're not talking hundreds of thousands of boots, small amount of special forces to fight forward on offense, not defense.
We've been fighting them over
Fight
there.
forward.
So we don't have to fight them here. Trillions
Could you
of
imagine?
dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives, millions of refugees, destabilized the entire region, and we haven't had another attack that killed 3,000 people. Oh, incidentally, for the past 6 weeks, we've lost, 2 months, we've lost 100,000.
Lost 100,000, and that's just, a bummer, and we should get back to cutting hair. But I think that, and also stabilized all sorts of, really parasitic and dysfunctional relationships between United States and Afghanistan and Pakistan that go back to the 80s that helped set all of this stuff in motion to begin with.
We've just reset the clock. And the idea that we have a semblance of freedom, I will remind people that the semblance of freedom is we have less freedom if you want to measure it in terms of civil liberties.
Well, that's what I wanted to say.
Could you imagine all sorts of surveillance laws that are winding their way through the House as we speak?
If after September 11th there was actually this is catastrophic, it's horrible, we're never going to allow this to happen again. We understand that there's an appetite for revenge and bloodlust and all the rest, but this just isn't how these things are dealt with. It might be not as emotionally satisfying, but we're going to actually take care of it. There's going to be arrests, apprehension, intelligence, targeting, all the rest of it. Not only, that could have set the trajectory in a completely different direction, obviously, but it's incredible to say on publicly that wars in the Middle East that have cost millions of lives, to the extent there has been any democratic progress in the Middle East, it's because of uprisings that have unfortunately mostly failed, but they were mostly organic uprisings starting several years later, frankly delayed by U.S. aggression in the Middle East. And then, at home, what have we had? Nothing but a steady and terrifying erosion of civil liberties for decades now.
Yeah, and how much of this primes the pump for, allowing that vented release of, bloodlust towards China when this is all over, really?
One wonders.
Well, China's the thing now. Terrorism's played out. Nobody cares. ISIS was the last hurrah. And so now the new game is China.
The boogeymen have a half-life. I noticed this back, in the early 90s when it was Gaddafi, and then it was Saddam, and then it was, it just sort of dances around as to who the boogeyman is. This is interesting. Here is Sean Hannity, who I don't want to say that, obviously the president is one of, if you had to pick an individual as to who is responsible for creating a sense that there is no reason to take coronavirus seriously, particularly in the months leading up to,
it's a flu.
It's a flu. He was arguing with Fauci at one point. And there's a lot of people who have messed up in the course of this. Obviously Donald Trump, but Cuomo putting a bunch of COVID patients into nursing homes that weren't prepared to do it. There's a story out today about the White House. Basically, there was a process that OSHA was developing, a set of regulations that would require, this is in following H1N1, that would require hospitals to maintain a certain amount of personal protection equipment and protocols and whatnot. 2017, the White House, specifically for respiratory epidemics, the White House comes in, quashes that as part of their, get rid of all regulations proposal. So there's a lot of land go around. Here is Sean Hannity, who is one of those guys who was out there, like we say, completely poo-pooing this thing. And you get the sense that he is a little worried about how history is going to look back at his initial 2 months response to this. And so now he's backtracking a little bit. He's worried about what's going on at the Ozarks on Memorial Day.
Lake of the Ozarks, packed with party goers this holiday weekend. Look, I understand these are young people. Experts keep saying over and over, they're at a much lower risk. But if they do get this, and again, there's no mask wearing here that I see, or not much at all. I see no social distancing. But if they get the virus and then are in contact with older and more vulnerable Americans, that could be a disaster for others. That's why in a short period of time, it's only temporary. You can't social distance. Please wear the mask. Do it for your mom, your dad, your grandma, your grandpa. My humble advice. You don't have to listen to me. I'm not a doctor. But
now, first off.
Hey, I'm not a punk.
There is a significant portion of the population who, when they get infected with COVID-19, have no symptoms. There's also a significant portion of people who recover and then have medical conditions for the rest of their lives, ranging from got to be on dialysis because now I have renal failure to, a whole host of other issues. And as I'm looking at that crowd at the Ozarks, with all due respect, I see a couple of comorbidities, incidentally, if they're young people, and they don't seem that young to me, but the young people there also could get ill. And so he's sort of like downplaying it. Like it's just for, these people over here, as if it's like some type of special, like it's stunning, even in the context of that. And then he's like, I'm not a doctor, so I don't want to make this like I'm pushing too much. Like I don't want to, all the doctors have said this. You don't need to be a doctor to know this at this point. That's the whole point. The doctors have told us.
Well, I also think it's incredible because look, obviously these people shouldn't be out doing this, but I'm not like a huge fan of these kind of public shaming videos because I think it distracts from the public policy. And so the idea that this guy was part of propagandizing that there wasn't a significant emergency taking place for a couple of months, and not just, I feel ashamed for, on an infinitely smaller platform, not talking about this earlier. Forget not talking about this earlier. This guy said it wasn't a problem. He said it was a flu. He basically mocked Fauci to his face when Fauci went on the platform, his program, to say, look, please, this is somewhat serious. And now he's tiptoeing back, not by even, of course, he's not going to attack Trump, but not by saying like, hey, we need to get some local supply chains for medical production or whatever. Now it's just, hey, here's an example of people being really flagrantly irresponsible. I won't even go after them that hard, frankly, because they might be my viewers. And I'll just turn it into a question of personal responsibility, which, that is what they do in the White House when they're not either poo-pooing it or dodging it or feeding conspiracy theories or saying we got to get back to work. They are leaning into like, hey, well, people have health problems. People are, people smoke. People do this. People do that. And it's like,
maybe if you hadn't eaten so much, you wouldn't get the COVID and you wouldn't die. And the idea that he wants to, it's both personal responsibility so you can blame it on the victims. And it's also personal responsibility so you can take the onus off of so that the idea that collectively we can do something and that we're interconnected is taken off. So it's all about like your grandma, your, it is F him, and he can do this all he wants. There you go, Sean Hannity. All right, time for one more call, and then we'll take some IMs. Call from an 810 area code. Who's this? You are the final caller of the day.
Sam, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Matt from Michigan.
Matt from Michigan. What part of Michigan, Matt? You don't have to get specific, but...
Well, I can get specific. Grand Lake, Michigan.
Grand Lakes, Michigan. Welcome to the program. What's on your mind?
Grand Blank.
Oh, Grand Blank.
Anyway, Grand Blank. It's 50 miles north of Detroit.
All right.
Open your
I was
ears.
going to ask you about what's your opinion about the vote by mail and how it's going to affect everything. And like I carry mail for a living, and over the years, it's usually elderly people or people who are incapacitated that have the ballot by mail. So we sent out this year all those applications to everybody, and on my mail route, everybody got one. And I was surprised by the amount of people that took advantage of it. And I would say probably 2/3 of my route took advantage of it. And they mailed them in, and then they get their ballots a couple weeks later in the mail. We had a millage recently, so everybody had to vote for the millage. But that means, too, during the election, there's going to be a lot more people voting by mail.
I mean, if your experience is indicative that 2/3 of the people, all right, presumably you're delivering mail to everybody in the district, and I don't know the details of the neighborhood the area that you're delivering in, but 2/3 participation in an election as a baseline would be incredible. I mean, I think that
last week you said there was no data that it would be to the Democrats' advantage, but I can't believe that it wouldn't be. I think it's going to be, I could be wrong, but I think it's going to be a major deal. And that's just Michigan, but there's many other states that are doing it.
Yeah,
too.
I mean, I don't know. There is no data that says it's specifically helpful to Democrats. That's the case. And it's also sort of like complicated by the fact that Trump's polling amongst elderly at the very least as a function of swing districts, he's lost like 18 points with them in swing districts.
Right.
He's still beating Biden, but not by much. And if you're Trump and you're not beating Biden by much with folks over the age of 65, you got real problems. And so, I mean, there's some data to suggest that like it's that it, exclusive vote by mail inhibits some people of color's voting rates because the mail is not as efficient there in terms of getting to them, not necessarily from a delivery standpoint, but in terms of like moving around and whatnot.
Right.
But I don't know. There's no. All it does, I think, is increase participation. I don't know that who it increases participation from, but it certainly makes it a lot easier to vote. I mean,
right. Well, like for years now, I've since I could vote, I go into our precinct. It's at our high school, and it's kind of a thing that I do. I feel good about it. I get my little voter sticker. I voted, but I took advantage of it. My wife took advantage of it. So we checked it. What it is, you get a slip in the mail. You check the box saying, yes, I want an absentee ballot. A couple weeks later, you sign it and date it. A couple weeks later, you get the absentee ballot. And I voted for our millage, and mailed it in. I'm going, wow, that's kind of cool. I mean, I've always gone to the precinct, but this is kind of neat just doing it from your home. Now, I can't believe if everybody's taking advantage, well, not everybody, but like I say, I got 360 addresses on my route, and 2/3 of them, and I got a small walk because I walk all day. And but there's other routes that have triple my address. 2/3 of them took advantage of it.
Well,
my opinion, it's got to be to the Democratic advantage because regular people voting do not vote for Republicans, and that's why that orange malignancy has been crying about voter by mail.
I mean, I think they certainly are afraid of it. Did you talk to any of the other fellow carriers in terms of their response rate?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same.
Huh.
When I get back, we bring our mail back and throw it in a bin, and there's a lot more vote by mail ballots than there used to be. It's like I said, it's usually elderly people that did it in the past, but
wow.
I'm talking 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old people are mailing it in because I know who's on my route, and they're taking advantage of it. Now, it's probably because of COVID.
Right. But once they get in the habit. All right. Appreciate the call.
Exactly.
I have to say, I find...
All right. Thanks for the call.
I'm not, politically, I'm not happy, obviously, but there's a part of me comedically that finds Joe Biden's just completely uninspiring campaign strategy might have been just the absolute right call politically from day one. Just sort of
it was lucky. I mean, honestly.
It was lucky, but no, I love it. It's just then there's going to be a pandemic and people are going to vote over mail, Jack.
Yeah, exactly. Here's my plan.
There, you're real worried about it. Oh, yeah, single payer? How about this?
When I'm going to win the pandemic, guy.
I'm going to win in a landslide, and I'm going to be sitting in a basement doing scrambled Facebook videos that don't make any goddamn sense.
That's the thing is that, like, the only thing that could screw it up is if I actually try and go on a couple of shows to hit some key constituencies and talk. Then I might have a problem.
Still won't make any difference.
I know it, but Amy Jean, Progressive Queen. Cynical. I work as a cashier at a grocery store, and recently more people are wearing the mask just below their nose. Don't people not understand it's spread just by breathing? They don't. Sorry that you're going through that. People are just like, Disco Stu, the cops in Michigan were on the side of the fascist protesters. That's why the legislature closed. Too taboo to admit your police force won't protect you. This applies broadly to police across the country. People need to be more afraid of these implications. Gons. In North Carolina, nobody is wearing a mask outside. CH355. Hey, crew, love you guys. How feasible do you think worker-owned co-ops or profit sharing could be at successfully unifying communities through the use of urban vertical farms with aquaponics?
I think it's pretty. That's super specific. I think this first part, I'm liking the instinct. I'd look up Mondragon. I'd look up Cooperation Jackson and Gar Alprovitz, who Sam interviewed, I think, in 2012, has a book on this and Richard Wolf's work. And I think it's definitely part of the answer. Vertical farms and hydroponics sound great too, but I would make it a little broader. The ventures that the community could go in on.
Yeah, relative to aquaponics, that's a little specific.
But check it out. Particularly, Mondragon is a pretty successful economic block. It employs thousands of people through a cooperative economy.
Noah from Tampa. I suspect that there's an uptick in police brutality due to the fact that mass protesting is less likely to occur to the pandemic. The Alberta energy minister was saying that there's never been a better time to build pipelines. I think the psychology existing is pretty much every form of authority around. Could be. Yeah. Maddie 420. I live in Maine in a county that is 4 on the list with the least amount of cases. Hancock County relies on tourism. We essentially live to serve people coming from all over, especially from New York and New Jersey. I'm a fast food worker and terrified we'll see a huge jump in people getting sick because nobody believes the virus is bad, as they say on MSN, because it's not happening around us yet. They don't think it's a problem. Nobody wears masks or distances. It's so frustrating. I don't know what to do. It's a blue state, so I'm thankful. But Trump's plan to push this onto states has been successful because everybody's blaming our new first female governor, Janet Mills. I mean, this is the scary dilemma, without a doubt. All right, 4 more. Jackie Daytona. Trump is mad as a wax banana. He's like a big turkey walking around the farm trying to control everything. Mass Gothic. Trump is the queeniest straight man. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, what was that? He doesn't do it anymore, but
Sassy Trump was perfect.
Sassy Trump was pretty great.
There's also a new one. I don't remember her name, but she sort of does. She does Trump over her. I don't know how to explain it, but
yes,
I'm sure people know what I'm talking about.
She lip syncs Trump.
She lip syncs
in a conversation with herself.
Right, and yes, there. Of course, the fact that this guy is some type of symbol of like virility and like American strength, and he goes up on stage and it's just like, the Emmys are not what they were. So sad. Well, it's hysterical. Yes, he sounds like my grandmother.
The big tell is that every time they do one of these like fan, portraits of him, they swap out his body.
Yes.
The big tell is that they have to like constantly boost this guy's manhood.
Yes, they literally have to just pretend. It's just like, yep, it's all him. And he's actually just incredible. He's not wearing awkwardly postured, obese, and bloated.
A bulletproof fat suit, and I've got a bulletproof fake prosthetic neck. And so when they do an image of me with bulging muscles, that's actually what's underneath.
That's what's underneath.
The other Biden, maybe I'm too gullible, but these past couple of months, I do feel like Joe Scarborough has been one of Trump's most ardent critics. I'm sure he has.
He has
but,
been.
That I would trade a couple of weeks of being critical during the run up to the election.
And how about even just saying, I keep widening the parameters. I'm very far from puritanical perfectionist. Just even say we massively effed up.
Yeah.
You heard the tapes of us joking around with him. We treated it as a joke. It was great for ratings. And now we're going to pay some penance. It's the seamlessness of like, hey, Donald, blah, blah, blah. To like, this man is the greatest threat to American democracy we've ever faced. And I'm going to say this without barely even a tip to our active role in promoting his candidacy for 2 years. I mean, just even bridge us with a little self-acknowledgement and apology. How's
that? A little gaslighty.
Yeah.
A Square, using this I am again to thank you all for giving us life by doing the shows and keeping the content at this high level, including the insightful contributions by Jamie and the production by Matt and Brendan, Mike, as well as great shows on TMBS. Is Joshua in that music intro coming back?
Joshua, definitely, of course. Yes. Joshua Kahn Russell is definitely coming back.
Johnny, hey Sam, love your show. Found you 1 year ago from the Pranking the Telemarketer video. Just joined today from Australia.
Wow, that's cool.
Looking forward to many more years. Thank you. And this is for you. And the final I am of the day. Q for short. The conspiracy that all deaths are being recorded as COVID deaths is sticking. Here in Idaho, there aren't refrigerated truck morgues yet. So it's easy to pretend like it's not happening. Hopefully there never will be.
Yeah.
Folks, stay safe. See you tomorrow.
Thanks, guys.
Take all the strength I got to get to where I want. But I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the lie bar. But finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I guess somewhere the choice was made.